Welcome to the WCN 2025 podcast series, the official podcast of the World Congress of Neurology, coming to you in the lead up to our global meeting in Seoul, South Korea this October 2025. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Lewis, and in each episode we meet the people behind the science, the speakers who are pushing the boundaries of our understanding in neurology. Today, it's my pleasure to be joined by Professor John Hardy, a neuroscientist based in the UK. He's one of the plenary speakers at WCN 2025 and will be presenting a talk on neurodegenerative diseases, specifically Alzheimer's disease, but not only Alzheimer's disease, and current research and therapies. Dr. Hardy, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks. It's nice to be here too. And of course, I'm looking forward to going to Seoul.
Well, we are very, very much looking forward to your presentation. To begin, could you introduce yourself to our listeners? Tell us a little about your background, your current title, and how you came to focus on brain aging and neurodegeneration.
So actually, my background, I started as a pharmacologist working on the biochemistry of Alzheimer's disease. And, when you work on the biochemistry, looking at brain tissue, you're looking at the end stage of disease, of course. You've got the brain in front of you, so clearly the disease is over. But in 1983, Jim Gusella reported a linkage to chromosome 4 in Huntington's disease. And I had a real road to Damascus feeling when I read that. I don't know, roads to Damascus is a bit complicated these days, but I had a real road to Damascus feeling about it because I saw that what he was doing was going towards how Huntington's disease started. And I thought, wow, that is such a cool way of being able to study disease. And I thought how great it would be to understand how Alzheimer's started through genetic analysis. You know how it finishes, you've got the brain in front of you, and then all you need to do is to, if you like, draw the line between how it starts and how it finishes. So that after that paper from Gusella, I decided to try and switch to genetic analysis, and I was very fortunate to be hired by a genetics department. If you like, I sold them my idea and they hired me, and I started to switch my lab from working on the pathology of the disease to the genetics. That was in 1984 or 1985. And we started to collect Alzheimer's families in England at that time. And that's how it started. So I've always been interested in neurological disease, but that's how I switched from doing pathology and biochemistry to genetics.
And that was about 1985. Now we're, I think, 40 years later. Walk us through the last 40 years and okay. Where we are today and what's been going on, how your journey, if you will.
So we were the very first family that wrote to us. Martin Rosser, who was my neurologist colleague, was a family from Nottingham, a town in the middle of the country, where 5 SIBs out of 10 had Alzheimer's disease with an age of onset of 55. A remarkable woman in the family called Carol Jennings brought the family to our attention, and we started to do genetic analysis. And long story short, we found amyloid mutations in that family. It took us 4 or 5 years. It was much more difficult to do genetic analysis in those days than it is today. And we found amyloid mutations. And that was really the first family in which we had, if you like, a defined molecular cause of the disease. And that led me to, I'm going to say, to postulate the amyloid hypothesis. That's a bit unfair because George Glenner and Colin Masters have both suggested amyloid was how the disease started, but our genetic finding, if you like, proved it in that family. And so I wrote an article called the amyloid cascade hypothesis, which really has driven research ever since. So that's how it started. And that's the story in part I'll tell, though it's an old story, much more exciting and relevant to your audience at WCN is the fact that now anti-amyloid therapies are beginning to work, and I'll tell the story of the development over the past 35 years and our understanding over that period, and I'll talk about why therapies have taken so long, but I'll also talk. Finally, the good news at the end, if you like, is amyloid therapies are working. They're not perfect, but we're on the way. And that's going to be the final, if you like, slide. I'll also, though, talk about the similarities and differences between the genetics of Alzheimer's disease and the genetics of Parkinson's disease and the genetics of the tangle diseases, because we're on the same path in those diseases as well.
What are those similarities or differences?
So the similarities in all cases in Alzheimer's disease, it's the similarity is that amyloid clearance is very important in sporadic disease. That clearance is largely through microglia. In Parkinson's disease, the similarity is that synuclein clearance is very important in Parkinson's disease, but it's a different clearance mechanism as it's largely lysosomes. And in the tangle diseases, again, it's clearance which is important, but in the tangle diseases, it's largely through the ubiquitin proteasome. So in all cases, it's the clearance of these proteins which is important. The difference is the clearance mechanisms are different in the different diseases.
It's fascinating. And getting back to what you talked about originally, which is the genetics of amyloid leading now, 40 years later to potentially or partially effective anti-amyloid therapies. What is the controversy right now about the amyloid hypothesis? I mean, where are we right now? How controversial is it? And if it is controversial, why is it controversial?
So, well, of course, you're asking somebody who doesn't believe it's controversial. So you're asking, so please, you should always take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But I think the reason it was controversial was reasonable, and that is that amyloid mutations are very rare. And I think people were prepared to believe that amyloid was important in those few cases and for other reasons in Downs and pre-senilin cases, but less willing to extrapolate to late onset disease. And I think that worry was quite legitimate. Now, though, now we have shown the drugs that remove amyloid are having a clinical effect. So I think that it really shouldn't be controversial anymore. That's my own view. I'm looking forward to arguing in the conference, I'm sure, with people who will have different views about that. And it's always good to cross swords with such people.
Well, that is a great preface, preamble, sneak preview, if you will, to what I know will be an outstanding plenary session and perhaps lead to great discussions among the audience. Anything else that the clinical audience should be aware of currently with regard to perhaps the status of the amyloid hypothesis, if you will, therapies, and what is to come? As you mentioned, these are effective, but certainly not a panacea. And what is next?
Well, let's deal with the problem with one of the problems with the therapies is that the antibodies that are given hit the amyloid in the blood vessels first, and they cause what's called amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, which is an inflammation of the blood vessels. The next generation of drugs, and these are in phase 2 trials now, are drugs which seem as if they avoid that side effect, if you like, by using a shuttle to take the amyloid antibody across the blood-brain barrier. So that's one thing that I think is coming and we can look forward to. I think it's worth saying why the therapies have taken so long. There's a number of reasons, but one of the reasons is I don't think we realized for a while that the antibodies that we gave needed to, if you like, suck amyloid out of the blood, out of the brain. The previous generations of antibodies, most of them prevented amyloid buildup, but they did not suck the amyloid that was already in the brain out of the brain. And it took a while, well, I can speak for myself, it took a while for the penny to drop, certainly for me, and I think for others as well, that just stopping buildup wasn't enough. We needed to actually suck amyloid out of the brain. The other thing that we still need to do, and this is also something I'll talk about, is get better at diagnosing the disease earlier. Can we use genetics and biomarkers to get better at diagnosing the disease earlier? There's a belief, and I'm one of the people who believe this, is that the drug should be both more effective if we could diagnose the disease earlier, but also have less side effects. Because if we could start to give the therapies before the amyloid built up in the blood vessels, that would presumably mean that we could avoid that very unpleasant side effect. So the analogy I like to use actually is that I think that we're on the North Carolina beach in the early 1900s. The Wright brothers have just done that figure-of-8 1-mile flight. Who would have believed that within 10 years we were flying across the channel? You know, once you've done something like the Wright brothers showed, then it gets easier to do it more and to do it better. And that's where we're up to, I think. From now on, I think every step will be a step forward.
So I always like to use the analogy. This is not the this is not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. Correct?
Something like that, exactly. That's exactly right.
Professor Hardy, we are so looking forward to your talk. This has just been an amazing, short, but very, very insightful preview. Anything else you'd like to add before I close up?
Well, I just think it's, you know, speaking for me personally, I knew the first family of course, who came to us and in which we found an amyloid mutation. The woman in that family said, she asked me how long it would take to develop therapies, and this is 1991, and I said 5 years, 10 years. And she said to me, and in the newspaper at the time, I don't think that this will help me, but it might help my children's generation. And sadly, she developed Alzheimer's disease. She died about 3 years ago. And but I do think that her prediction at how long it would take was accurate. And I really dedicate this talk really to her and to the other families with the disease.
Well, that's an incredible story, and thank you for all those patients you've seen, all the work you've done to really pave the way for this new generation of therapies on the horizon, and perhaps there already. Again, thank you so much, Professor Hardy. I think the audience will be many, many clinicians like me, as well as researchers, trainees, people in all stages of their career. Not to give away the ending, if you will, but what will be the main take-home point, do you think, for the clinicians and the audience who will be very, very fortunate enough to see you in person, meet you in person, and again, we hope very, very many of you will be there to meet such profoundly important researchers like Professor Hardy. But what will be the final take-home point for us clinicians?
I think the final, there's hope. That's the first thing. There's hope. I think we've got this disease, if you like, on the run. But I think the lesson we all need to work towards is getting better at early diagnosis. We need to get much better at early diagnosis, you know, to treat the disease earlier and to avoid the side effects So that is the thing that I would say, that the message I would give to clinicians: really be ambitious about making early and accurate diagnoses.
And that early and accurate diagnosis will, by definition, this is more of a question than a statement, include preclinical diagnosis? And if so, how early is too early?
Well, there's nothing. My colleague here, Nick Fox, says there's no disease in which it's better to treat late. So, and that, of course, is true. I think, though, that we want to be starting treatment before amyloid buildup really gets hold, and you start to build up the other pathology. So, I would say somewhere between about 5 years before clinical symptoms start to appear is a good ambition.
Again, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise. I am very, very much looking forward to your session, as I know it'll spark great conversation, perhaps some controversy, but more important, conversation and insights, and be very, very exciting at the Congress. So thank you to everyone listening. We very, very much look forward to seeing you in Seoul this October for the World Congress of Neurology, for wonderful speakers like Professor Hardy and others. And John, thank you again for joining us today.
My pleasure.